Hello and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. Today I'm going to show you how to paint a very simple impression of sunset during winter. So I'm going to balance up between a nice calm looking sunset in yellow shade against some cool grays. Painting is rather small, which is A6 size, and I wouldn't want to call it a miniature painting, but if you think this is a miniature painting, it's up to you. So most of the time I am going to be using a micro brush in order to paint on this small size painting. So to kickstart, I have pre-wet the entire paper with some clean water using a mop style brush, and the first shade is going to be some lemon yellow or citron with some Indian yellow. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use micro brush in order to paint in, especially painting all those small subjects. For example, the sun image over here, I have first painted a circle and leaving a white space in between, which is going to be the brightest part of the sun. Also lifting out some pigment using a dry paper towel as the pigment starts to bleed into the middle part of the sun image. Next, in order to create some color coordination that mimics a sunset shade, I'm using Naples yellow. If you don't have Naples yellow, it's okay. You can mix in some bright red, just a hint of bright red into your yellow mix, and you'll arrive at this nice looking orange or amber hue. I'm just painting it over, trying to create that impression of the usual sunset scenery that you used to observe in the sky. In order to achieve these soft brush strokes, you have to ensure that the paper surface is still wet or at least damp. And of course, logically speaking, if you're painting this on a larger size of paper as in A5 or A4, obviously you will need to use a bigger brush as in round brush. Otherwise, it could take ages to complete your painting. So moving on, I need a darker shade of orange or amber. So I've mixed in more of the cadmium red to the yellow mix, so you'll get a darker orange, and just focus especially around the brightest part of the sun. So these are just minor brush strokes, and once again you can keep on modifying the look of the middle part of the sun as what I'm doing here. Right now I am trying to lift out all those excess staining onto the white part, and next I need some gray shade. As I said earlier, this is a winter sunset scenery, so I need some gray shade, and if you have a ready-made gray, go ahead. I'm mixing some ultramarine with some burnt sienna until I arrive at this cool gray, and using once again my micro brush to drop in between those yellow shades. Alright, done with the sky painting. Next I need to paint the details of the landscape. Once again I'm making some gray mix shade. However, I have modified the paint mix ratio, whereby you could notice that this gray shade looks a bit darker and has got more brownish hint to it, which is why I prefer mixing my gray on my own instead of using a ready-made gray. So you can have variations in your gray mixes. So following the landscape details, over here you can see me using a clean damp brush to soften the values of the gray brush strokes, gray shade brush strokes that I've applied earlier. So this gives a snowy looking ambience, as in snow covered ground. Alright, now that the painting is completely dry, I'm going to paint some details as a second layer. Over here I am mixing indigo with some sapphire and arriving at a very dark shade which is very similar to a black shade. If you like to use a black shade, go ahead. Personally, I feel black would be too dark, so this color fits better. So I'm going to paint in some trees, and I'm going to use a script brush because these are going to result in very fine lines. So winter trees, you know what it looks like, all sticks, branches, twigs and so on. So just use mainly the tip of your script brush or a rigger brush, whichever suits your needs and size of the painting. Just make these brush strokes that mimics the sharp and random twigs and branches. Usually you start from the bottom because that's where the tree trunk is thicker. So kickstart from the bottom, and then as you move upwards, you're gonna slightly lift the tip of the brush off the paper, thus resulting on those narrow tip or ends. And in the beginning it may be a bit difficult to grasp, but with practice you will get the trick. Alright, I've got another trick in order to make your winter trees look lively. I'm just spraying some water, or spritz some water onto the painted twigs while it's still wet, and after that I'm going to use a clean brush, the same script brush which I have cleaned, and just move those pigments, those wet pigments, especially towards the top of the trees. And this process basically stains all those areas in between the branches and twigs that you have painted, creating a look of the wintry trees. I'm sure you would have noticed, whether it's a sunset, usually it's under the sunset, there are some shades in between, simply because there are some minor twigs in between those branches, and you can't be going on painting every micro detail. So this is the best way to do it. And you can also touch the wet area using the tip of your brush to stain it further to create more effect with those bleeding dots, as in some dry leaves or some birds sitting or hanging around in the trees. Painting in more trees in the background, of course it's in a smaller size just to create the impression of distant trees in distant. So they are definitely smaller in size compared to the main trees, three main trees that I've painted on the left hand corner. This type of tiny details creates more depth into your painting, as it creates a perspective of an environment that you observe, instead of appearing flat and putting too much focus on only one side of the painting. A little bit of water spritz onto those tiny trees painting as well, and creating the same effect that I made for the main trees. In other words, by painting these tiny details, you get to balance up the entire painting's look. Some additional landscape details, as in a lower hillside, and I'm using the same dark shade that I used to paint the trees. Just repainting those tiny trees in the background, as I felt the water staining has faded it a little bit, so it's just a touch up. Now, since this is a sunset scenery, some mild shadows on the ground could add more depth. So over here you can see me mixing in once again some cool grey shade, and before I apply the paint, I am just pre-wetting the areas that I want the shadows to appear. And after pre-wetting it, you can see me lightly applying those light grey shade. These are not very thick in consistency because, as I mentioned, I want it to appear very light, mild shadow since this is a winter scenery. A simple winter landscape impression with very minor brush strokes, small details. As long as you know how to add depth, you can make a great painting. It doesn't have to be complicated. So if you find this tutorial very helpful and fun, then do hit the like, share and subscribe button. I'll see you in another tutorial. Bye.